Hello, Dr. Williams here again. I've got another video for you. This time, this one's all about B7 ecology, and it's all the combined science content that you're going to need to know if you're having a test on this unit or your paper 2 exam. Okay, the first thing to note when you're learning about B7 ecology is that there are a certain number of key terms that you should be able to define before going into this topic. First one is what an ecosystem is. So an ecosystem is the interaction of a community of living organisms, the biotic things, with the non-living parts of their environment. So it's basically how all the interactions occur in an ecosystem. Community is the next one, and that's all of the living organisms present in an ecosystem at a given time. So the words in bold are really important. You can work with the other words around them, but the words in bold are essential for you to be able to define these correctly. Population's the next one, all of the organisms of just one species in a habitat, and you should know the definition of species from B6. So if you're not sure, go back and look at that video, or remember that a species is all of the organisms which are able to breed together and produce fertile offspring. If you can do that, you are members of the same species. Biodiversity is the variety of all the different species of organisms within an ecosystem. So if you think of the word diverse in biodiversity, it's that sense of the variety and different species of organisms. And biomass is all of the living material in an organism. To measure this correctly, you have to dehydrate those organisms so they have no water. So you can't really accurately measure biomass of living things because the water is still present. But all the biomass on Earth generally originates from organisms which can photosynthesize, like plants and algae, and that biomass that has been made from the sunlight's energy has been converted into solid molecules like glucose and proteins, and that's what forms the biomass. So these terms are really important that you go in and you are able to define really accurately. Okay, when we've got an understanding of those key terms, we can start to think about how we might apply them. So in an ecosystem, if we're thinking about the biotic and abiotic parts interacting, then we have to know what we mean by those two things. So abiotic means non-living, usually an A in front of the word or an in front of the word means without. And biotic means living. So here you can see some common examples of abiotic factors in ecosystems and the biotic factors. So anything to do with living things are biotic factors. So have a good look at them and make sure that you're familiar with the common factors of ecosystems. And when you've got all of these abiotic and biotic factors in your ecosystem, you're still going to have competition for them. So plants will compete for 4 key things, and they are light, enough space for them to grow, the nutrients which they get from the soil and the mineral ions that are found in the soil, and water. Whereas animals will compete mainly for food, for their mates to be able to breed, and territory, that land where they live, where they might have their homes, and also hunt for food and things like that. So you can see that they compete for different things, and it's important that you know which what plants compete for and what animals compete for. And in order to carry out effective competition, we need organisms to adapt to their surroundings. So this does again link in with natural selection and those ideas from B6. So it's worth making sure you understand those principles when you're thinking about adaptations. And all organisms adapt to be able to live in their natural environments and survive in the conditions where they normally live. So they need to be able to adapt to these environments. And these adaptations can be grouped as being structural. So for example, a shape or a colour, and the example given there is a tortoise's shell. Behavioural, which is more about what they do, the fact they might want to bathe in the heat of the day like hippos do. Or functional, that's generally to do with their cells or what's happening inside an organism. For example, the one given there is the Arctic fish with an antifreeze protein. So you should be able to label adaptations as any of those 3 things. And the organisms which can do this most effectively are able to live in very extreme environments. So they're very highly adapted. So environments with super high temperatures, pressure, or even salt concentration, where most organisms can't live, there are some organisms which we would call extremophiles, which are able to live in those really extreme conditions. And they are highly adapted to their surroundings. And that obviously gives them advantages in terms of competition and being able to survive in very harsh environments where the organisms won't. So again, remember, this links to natural selection. It's not that an organism will choose to adapt in a certain way. This is done by natural selection, and that the embedded nature of that is that there is variation due to the DNA, and the mutations in that DNA leads to variations, and some of those variations will help organisms to survive and breed, and they are the ones that will pass on those alleles for that variation into their offspring. And this all comes back to that random mutation in DNA. So organisms will adapt to their surroundings because they are better at surviving and breeding in those surroundings. The next thing to think about in ecosystems is how all those interactions play out. So when you've got all those different populations of species in an ecosystem, they're all going to interact with each other and compete with each other and feed off each other. And that is all called interdependence. And you can represent any feeding relationships in ecosystems with a food chain or a food web. Food webs are a lot more better in helping us understand what can go on inside an ecosystem, and it looks at other biotic factors that might affect individual species within it. A food chain is just one of those branches or pathways that you can see on this diagram. So there is a chain from cabbage to caterpillar to chaffinch and cat, but together with other food chains, this forms our food web. And in a food web, we've got to remember that all of the biomass that exists in the food web actually originates from organisms that can photosynthesize, so like plants and algae. And that's because they are called producers. And all these producers can carry out photosynthesis using energy from the sun to produce their own source of glucose. And that glucose is the fundamental structure for making the biomass. It's the building block for making all of that organism's biomass. And so they assemble the glucose into larger molecules like proteins and fats, and altogether that would make up an organism's biomass. And it's important here to remember the photosynthesis equation. This will come up later as well, but you need to be able to recall this even though it was on paper one, because a lot of this idea really underpins all the interactions which take place inside an ecosystem. And without plants carrying out photosynthesis, we wouldn't have that glucose, and therefore we wouldn't have the biomass. Consumers are animals that rely on eating other organisms to survive. That might be other consumers or producers. So they are basically going to feed on those animals or plants, and this can be shown in the food chain. An example of one is given there, and these food chains will show the feeding relationships within that community. So the arrow is actually showing the transfer of the energy from one species to the next. So the algae has got the energy from the sun and turned it into glucose, and the krill is going to eat the algae, and that glucose is going to be used as its source of energy. So you can see the arrow should always point to the next consumer in the food chain. And we can actually label the different stages of our food chain. We can give them different terms to help us describe what's happening. So our algae would be the producer, so that is going to carry out photosynthesis. Our krill, which is going to eat the algae, is a primary consumer. And it's also, though, a prey of the next consumer in the food chain, which is the salmon. And because the krill in this food chain will only eat algae, we would call it a herbivore. Our salmon is our secondary consumer, the second consumer in the food chain. It is prey to the bear, but it's also a predator of the krill. And it would be, in this food chain, the salmon would be considered a carnivore because it's eating meat, essentially eating another consumer. Our bear is our tertiary consumer. We can also call it the apex predator because it's right at the top of the food chain and nothing will hunt and eat the bear. And it's also a carnivore because, as you can see, it only eats the salmon. Now, whether you think the bear actually should be an omnivore, it's irrelevant really. It's what is presented in your food chain is what you work with. So in this example, the bear is just eating salmon, and therefore you would classify it as a carnivore. And food chains can only represent one way the energy is transferred, which is why food webs are a lot better, because obviously consumers aren't just going to feed on one prey, they're going to eat a variety of different prey. So food webs are better because they show all of the feeding relationships inside a ecosystem or a community, and they involve a number of interactions. And you can start to think about the effects of one species decreasing in numbers might have on not just the species that directly eats it, but all of these other species inside that food web as well. And when we start to look closer at relationships in food chains and webs, we can see predator-prey relationships. If it's healthy and balanced in our ecosystems, the numbers of predators and prey will fluctuate but remain fairly constant. So the numbers will go up and down depending on abiotic and biotic factors in our ecosystems. But the numbers will generally stay around the same if the ecosystem's stable. They obviously are going to go up and down during each year, but generally the numbers tick along when they're stable. These repeating patterns are called predator-prey cycles, and you can spot in a predator-prey cycle which is the predator and which is the prey, because the peaks of where the numbers are highest, the prey numbers are always higher. The peak's always higher slightly before the predator numbers. So you can see the peak of the prey is always before the peak of the predator. And it makes sense that the total numbers of predators in any ecosystem is actually always going to be lower than the numbers of prey. There simply needs to be enough prey for the predators to eat. So the numbers of predators is always lower as well. So the predator-prey cycles often show this sort of relationship. And you can plot them on a graph like this, and you can look at where the peaks are and the difference in the numbers to work out which is the prey and which are the predators. And we can actually count species quite easily using a piece of equipment called a quadrat. It's obviously going to be difficult to count foxes and rabbits using quadrats, so you'll have to think of other strategies for doing that. For example, you can try and take video recordings, so set up wildlife cameras in certain areas and try and identify the number of foxes or rabbits that might be there. So living organisms, which are animals, are much trickier to actually accurately calculate. But with plant species, it's quite easy to use a quadrat. But again, this will only estimate the numbers of species in a given area. So you need to understand how to do this process because it is one of the required practicals. So let's just see what we mean by measuring distribution and abundance of species. So in order to monitor the distribution and abundance of organisms in any community, you've got to count and estimate the numbers of species in each population. This is because it's an estimate, because it just would not be practical to go and count every single plant species of a given area, because often you're working with such large areas. So what you do is you do some sampling, and to carry out sampling, you need to use a quadrat. Typically, these are 0.5 metre by 0.5 metre, and they are metal squares, and you can just place them on the ground. And you can do this to measure the distribution and abundance of species using two methods. Method one is random sampling, where you want to measure abundance and distribution over a large area like a school field. And method two might be systematic sampling, where you're measuring the abundance distribution of species over a specific area, often in comparison with another abiotic factor, and often in a straight line. So, for example, from the edge of the field towards the centre of the field. So let's have a look at these in more detail. If you want to do random sampling, the first thing you need to do is to measure your area sampled and work out a numbered grid. So you could do that metre by metre. So for example, here's a square of 10 metres by 10 metres of the fields that we're going to sample. And then we can number the columns and the rows, and we can use a random number generator to generate two numbers to locate a square of the grid. So you can find random number generators on computer programs or on a calculator. And then the next thing you do, when you've got your numbers generated from the random number generator, you would place your quadrat on the identified grid square, and you would count the number of organisms inside that quadrat. And you would have to repeat that, I said, at least 10 times. Obviously, this would depend on the area that you're going to sample, and the more repeats you do, the more accurate your estimate will be. But you've got to be realistic about it. So a realistic but largish number of repeats is always the best strategy. When you've done this a number of times, you can calculate the mean number of species that you've counted per quadrat. So for example, if you're counting, if these represent daisy plants rather, then in square number 4 and 1 here, we've got 2, whereas in square number 5 and 3 here, we've got 3. So you would count them all up and you would calculate the mean. You'd count how many daisies and calculate the mean in those 10 quadrats. And then when you've done that, you would work out the total area of the whole space. When you've got the total area, you've got the mean number of plants per quadrat, you would work out how many quadrats would fit into that area, and you multiply your mean by the number of quadrats that would fit into your area. And this will give you an estimate. Now, this number is normally a lot bigger than you think. So we're usually talking thousands here when you've counted a particular species in a given area. So just be mindful that it might be quite a large number, and check any calculations that you need to do quite carefully. The other type of sampling is called systematic sampling, and this is where you have basically a system to your sampling. So normally you would lay a tape measure where you want to be sampled. That could include across different kind of across the field, from where there's a shaded place to where there's a less shaded place, or across a sort of pondy, boggy area, and you might want to lay your transector across that, okay? Then you would place the quadrat every metre or maybe every 10 metres. Again, that depends on the size of the area that you want to sample. You've got to be realistic about it. If you're sampling 100 metres, you don't place your quadrat every metre. You'd maybe place it every 5 or 10 metres. And you'd always do that consistently. So always use the left-hand side of the tape, place the top corner at the meter, for example, so that you're doing that with a consistent approach. And then you'd count the numbers of organisms, or remember, if there's too many organisms to count, you'd do an estimate of the percentage cover. And then often with this, you want to compare it against another abiotic factor. That might be the pH of the soil. So you take a little pH soil sample, or it could be the amount of light. So you'd measure the light intensity with a light intensity meter, and you would take a sample and record that alongside with the number of species that you're recording. And then you'd actually want to repeat that transect, probably another twice, looking at the same kind of things, and then you can obviously work out a mean with those different repeats that you've taken there. So that's systematic sampling. With both types of sampling, systematic and random, you need to be able to recall and write a method for both types of sampling, and you need to process data associated with it as well. So my advice would be to go and find some practice questions about those two types of sampling. Right, the next part then is to start thinking about how materials are cycled within ecosystems. So we can have abiotic and biotic cycles, and the water cycle is an example really of an abiotic cycle. The idea that plants and animals need water, they live in it, they need to be able to drink it, and fresh water is an especially important source for land plants and animals. And so this water and the cycling of water to produce fresh water is really important for their survival. So often with the water cycle, there's not many living things that involve in the cycling of water. The water in the oceans and seas actually just evaporates and condenses in the air to form clouds. Obviously, when you've gone through evaporation and the formation of clouds by condensation, any salt that might have been in the seawater has been left behind. So this water in the clouds is actually not got salt in it. The water then falls to the land as precipitation. So that could be rain or hail or snow. And then it runs through the rocks and into the rivers and the lakes and the streams. And this is our source of fresh water. All of these freshwater sources actually lead back into the seas and oceans. So then the water cycle starts again. And this cycling is abiotic because not many living organisms are involved in it. Really, the main living organism involved in this cycle is plants, and plants will obviously use transpiration. It's one of their methods of moving water through the plant, and plant transpiration can also contribute to the evaporation of water into the formation of clouds. So that's where the only really living organism involved in this cycle is. Most of the materials are recycled thanks to our microorganisms carrying out decomposition. So really we're thinking about bacteria and fungi and the way that they digest decaying matter so they can use it themselves for their own respiration and growth. This idea that they decay this decaying matter means that they are led to being called decomposers. And this process of decomposition or decay helps to recycle nutrients into the ground so that plants and animals can reuse them. During this decomposition, because the microorganisms are using the nutrients in the waste for respiration, they will carry out aerobic respiration. And often as a byproduct, we get heat, carbon dioxide and water released by these microorganisms carrying out respiration. So you can see that already we're starting to link in ideas between respiration and the cycling of other nutrients by these microorganisms. And the reason that decomposers are so good at recycling nutrients for other organisms to use is that because the way they digest their nutrients that they need to absorb in order for their own growth, they do it by releasing digestive enzymes into the surroundings. And these enzymes will break insoluble molecules into soluble molecules so that they can be absorbed into their cells. They can't absorb all of these nutrients, though, that the enzymes manage to break up. So what happens is that many of these nutrients are absorbed by the soil by plants. So you'll get the mineral ions absorbed by plants, which can help them to then make proteins for their growth. So we get the nitrates that are produced by these digestive enzymes in the soil. They can be used to make amino acids, which are turned into proteins and lead to growth by the plants. So nutrient-rich soil really helps plant growth. So therefore, microorganisms in the soil with enough waste for them to decay will really help their growth as well. So a cycle which involves more living things in it is the carbon cycle. We can really think about this as very much a biotic cycle because it's involving living organisms to recycle carbon. And we know that there are two key processes, respiration and photosynthesis, which recycle the carbon molecules in glucose. And here you can see both of those processes, and together these processes form a key part of the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is how organisms basically use the carbon in the glucose to produce carbon dioxide during respiration, or to use carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to produce glucose in photosynthesis. Obviously, photosynthesis can only be carried out by producers, which are plants and algae, whereas respiration, remember, it's carried out by plants, algae, animals, bacteria, and fungi. All living things carry out respiration. So let's have a look at the carbon cycle in more detail. We can see that in the carbon cycle, there are some abiotic processes in that combustion is an abiotic process that can be releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And there's also the process of carbon dioxide being absorbed from the atmosphere into oceans. I think you'll learn more about this in the C9 topic about the atmosphere. So it'd be worth looking at that while you're looking at this. And then the biotic cycles involved are photosynthesis, which is where producers use light energy and carbon dioxide to make glucose, and respiration, where we are going to get all living things using respiration to use the carbon dioxide in order to release energy. And they'll also use the glucose to make more biomass in terms of fats and proteins and things like that. Okay, so this is quite a nice, simple diagram of what a carbon cycle might look like. You might get a blank carbon cycle where you have to name those processes that are involved. So you can see that there are feeding relationships involved. There's obviously death and decay, and all of those sorts of key processes involved in the carbon cycle. So if we want ecosystems to survive, we've got to make sure that all of these living cycles, like the carbon cycle, and all of the organisms that are interacting together are really functioning well. And the numbers of these organisms need to be able to be sustained in that ecosystem. And how we can measure this is called biodiversity. Biodiversity is just a measurement of how well an ecosystem is functioning. And biodiversity is all of the variety of different species of organisms within an ecosystem. And if you have high biodiversity, you're going to have a much more stable ecosystem because you're reducing that dependence that we need on one specific species for food or shelter or maintenance of the physical environment. So you can see that the characteristics of an ecosystem with high biodiversity are that they are stable with lots of successful species and interactions between many species, complex food webs, and lots of niches with great variety of organisms and a greater variety of food for animals. So they are less susceptible to climatic change and less harsh environmental conditions within them. And you can see low biodiversity has quite the opposite. So I'm sure you can think of some examples of higher biodiversity, things like tropical rainforests, and low biodiversity, places like the Arctic. Okay, and if we think about humans as part of this picture, we know that the human growth, there's a growing human population, and if humans carry on growing, we're going to use more resources, more waste, and more land for building, farming, quarrying, and dumping waste. And the growing population could have a negative effect on the biodiversity of ecosystems. If we are using the land for things like buildings, then there isn't that land there for those plants and animals that might have been living there originally. And if we don't actually get rid of the waste that we produce when we are building space on land and then living in them, then we're going to cause pollution as a result. And so humans need to not only effectively manage where they're building, why they're building, but also what they're going to do with the waste that is produced from any areas that they're going to use for building or farming and things. And so pollution is going to occur whenever you are getting humans using land to house them, because you're going to get pollution from the sewage that is produced. So that sewage can be pumped directly into waters and rivers and streams and lakes, and that will obviously affect the water cycle. You can get other pollution in water when the rainwater falls onto lands. If humans have been using that land for agriculture, they might have some herbicides or pesticides or even like fertilizers, and they can run off into our streams and rivers, and they might carry toxic chemicals or fertilizers into those rivers and streams and cause something called eutrophication, which we'll talk about in a minute. We can get pollution in air where we get particulates, which are tiny bits of carbon, and you can get acidic gases like sulfur dioxide, which can cause acid rain. And then on the land, we can get pollution from landfill and any toxic chemicals that might come from waste. So one of the issues with pollution in water is this process of eutrophication. And eutrophication is caused by fertilizers being used on land. Obviously, we need fertilizers to support plants to grow, but if there are excess fertilizers or they are too easily dissolved, then when it rains, they will dissolve in them, and then this fertilizer will run into the rivers. We can consider sewage as a form of fertilizer, because if it's got waste in, it's going to promote the growth of decomposers. So these fertilizers will run off into ponds and lakes, and there will obviously be an increase in nutrients, which you might think is a good idea. And initially it is to help all the plants grow, but it supports algae on the surface of water in particular to grow better than all of the other plants. And this algal growth prevents the light from entering the bottom of the pond where aquatic plants can grow. In this case, then, aquatic plants at the bottom of the pond can't carry out photosynthesis. And they're obviously really important because photosynthesis releases oxygen. And so the lack of photosynthesis will mean that the plants die, so there's less dissolved oxygen in the water because the plants aren't releasing any oxygen anymore. And actually that plant death is going to lead to decomposition, and more oxygen will actually be used by the decomposers in aerobic respiration. So you've got no more oxygen being put into the water and more oxygen being used by decomposers. That means that oxygen levels decrease, the animals will then die, and even more decomposition will happen because those dead animals will be decomposed again. In extreme cases, this can lead to really toxic waters with anaerobic respiration now occurring because there's literally no oxygen left. So humans need to use land sensibly and mindfully to think about how they are polluting the area and what the land might be used for. Because any use of land will decrease the biodiversity and destroy habitats. And there are 4 main ways that land is used: building, quarrying, farming, and dumping waste. Agriculture, which is the growth of crops, can harm ecosystems, in particular when you grow just one type of crop plant every year on the same land, or you use pesticides or insecticides to kill organisms, and it could kill any of the organisms in your food web that are insects, for example, and that would obviously affect all the consumers, not just the insects themselves. Any removal of hedgerows to make the fields larger while they get more yield for their crops, they would not have the habitats for birds and other species to nest or to feed or to shelter. If you grow the same crop on the field every year, so you're not only growing monocultures, just one type of crop, but you're still growing that year on year, then you can use the same nutrients out of the soil all the time. And if you also actually put animals grazing onto the fields, then that is going to cause an issue, because obviously they're going to be eating the plants as well as releasing their own waste onto the fields, and that could cause pollution as well. Another way humans can aid pollution in our environment is by digging up peat bogs. Peat is an ancient kind of soil that's been formed over thousands of years. It's actually used in compost, less so now, but it has been really frequently used in compost and can be burnt as a source of fuel. So this soil that comes from peat bogs is quite rich as a source of fuel and compost. It contains partially decayed moss. And it takes such a long time for peat to form, and it's in acidic and anaerobic conditions in the bog, and it's very specific conditions, but it makes it a very rich soil for using as compost or fuel. And the destruction of peat bogs is bad because it greatly reduces the biodiversity in that area that's been there for thousands of years. Just actually digging up the peat releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, and that's been locked up in there by the plants for thousands of years, and we're releasing it just by digging that up. And then also, if you're going to burn it or you're going to leave it on your crops as a compost, the microorganisms will decompose that peat and respire, and the peat is going to be burned and more carbon dioxide will be released. So it actually really does increase the amount of carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere. Another thing that increases the amount of carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere is deforestation. Obviously, trees are a huge importance for photosynthesis, for taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But if you start to deforestation and you remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and you remove that potential for the CO2 to be removed by photosynthesis. Obviously, chopping down trees, they would have provided food and shelter for animals, and their roots also hold soil particles together, which helps to prevent erosion. So when we start to carry out deforestation and remove the forests, there are going to be less plant and animal species present because there's less variety of foods and habitats. The forest areas might also be replaced by buildings, by poor yielding monocultures, agriculture, landfill, cattle, all those sorts of things. The trees that have been cut down are burned or left to rot, and that also will increase the release of CO2 from those processes of combustion and decay. And less CO2 has been taken away by the trees as well. So it's really not very good for our ecosystems. And all of this carbon dioxide, along with methane, can contribute to global warming. If you chop down trees and then put cattle on it, cattle are a big producer of methane, as well as rice fields. They all produce high levels of methane. So these two greenhouse gases are going to actually contribute to global warming. In extreme environments, we know that our ecosystems are unstable, and so species diversity is low and dominated by these abiotic factors, these kind of temperatures, rather than the biotic factors in the community. Therefore, global warming is going to have a much greater effect on extreme environments where the species diversity is low and a few species only have the necessary adaptations in order to survive. So it's really important that we look at ways to reduce methane and carbon dioxide being put into our atmosphere, and think really carefully about what we are going to do with our land more effectively in order to be able to manage the stresses that might come with increased global temperatures. So to maintain biodiversity in areas is going to be a key thing moving forward for human populations. Measures can be put in place by individuals and governments to try to reduce that negative effects that humans are having on ecosystems. These sorts of measurements to help the biodiversity include breeding programs, protection and regeneration of rare habitats like those peat bogs and things, reintroduction of field margins and hedgerows so that farmers can't just use all of the field for growing their crops. There's got to be a certain area of land for hedgerows. Reduce and legislate deforestation so that you can monitor carbon dioxide emissions and hopefully reduce those, and recycling resources rather than putting them into landfill. So all of these can help with maintaining biodiversity and making sure that we are not polluting unnecessarily. So that's it for B7, really. Lots of things to think about. especially with lots of context in there. So the specifics of the key terms and the processes are really important to help understand really what's going on with the big picture about ecology and ecosystems. So good luck with any exams. I suggest you practice some exam questions now and put some of that into practice.